Muses, which is a centre of peace and global philosophy, as you know. And you've been involved in spiritual journeying and seeking and looking for peace through many, adventures over the years.
That's true.
So I thought we could, and I've kind of done the same really in a different way, although we've never met before this weekend. So I thought it'd be nice if we had a discussion about each other's journeys and compare and contrast, because we've got friends in common, and it's interesting, I think.
I think it is too.
And then we can get a record of that,
Great.
for people who aren't here this weekend.
Yeah, I'm very glad to be here because I like that you formed the Institute of International Peace Studies and Global Philosophy, because it gives a grounding to what I perceive as this new movement in humanity. That I think we are moving toward peace. I think we're moving toward nonviolence on a massive scale, and I think that, we may even see it in our lifetimes.
Well, I certainly live for that hope, I was in that generation in the 60s that was influenced by the blending of Western and Eastern philosophy. I call it the meta-Mahayana position, which is very much a kind of Californian take on reality. And when I took Mahayana Buddhist vows at the age of 19, I took the vow to reach enlightenment in this lifetime, but not just for me personally, but for the whole of humanity. And, that's a very naive thing to do as a 19-year-old, but I certainly thought it was possible, and I haven't given up that faith.
Well, it sounds like something like that would come from the depth of you, because I don't think you could really come to that understanding unless you were really sincere. Because in that sincerity of finding that for yourself, that would incorporate that for humanity too.
Yeah, I don't think you can get personal enlightenment. I worked out that fairly early on. It's collective. Enlightenment's a shared experience. It's like a samadhi that is we all participate in.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of alternate with questions.
Okay. Would you like to go first?
General discussion. Okay. One of the things you've been talking about this weekend is a conference kind of convocation that happened about 30 years ago, when I know that Ronnie Lang, Rupert Sheldrake, Jill Peirce, and various other people met in California, and you were there. And that seems to have been quite an important event for you. Can you tell me who organised it? What was that about?
Well, Joan Halifax, who used to be a research scientist, a research assistant for Joseph Campbell, and was an anthropologist and a well-known author and into the science of mysticism,
right,
in a way, had organized the whole thing at the Ojai Foundation, which was her foundation. And I came to it because I was friends with John and Tony Lilly. And it was Tony's suggestion, really. She told me about this Way of the Warrior program. And at that time, 30 years ago, I'd been practicing Aikido for about 6 months. And when I heard about it, it sounded interesting, and Tony said, they're going to film it. Why don't you see if you can get on the film crew? So I happened to know the director who was going to be directing it, so I called him up, and he said, sure. We wouldn't get paid much, but we would be able to participate in this event. And so it seemed like a very worthwhile project. But at the time, even though it sounded interesting, I had no idea it would be as profound an experience for me as it turned out to be.
And it was called the Way of the Warrior program.
It was called the Way of the Warrior.
And who were some of the people that were there?
Well, the facilitators of the group were Joan Halifax, R.D. Lang, Francis Huxley, Rupert Sheldrake, Jill Peirce, Bob Aubrey, who is an Aikidoist, and a Native American shaman named Harley Swiftdeer.
Okay, yes. Okay.
That was the main group.
Right.
And at the time, Rupert and Jill, I don't think, had met.
So they actually met there?
I think they met there. I'm pretty sure that's true. And, they ended up getting married. And Francis Huxley met Adele Getty there, I'm pretty sure.
Who I met in London some years ago, yeah.
Right, and I think they got together there. And of course my wife came out about a month later, and we've been together for 30 years now.
So shouldn't it have been called the Way of the Lover?
It might have been, and in a way it kind of was. I remember the word of the day was grexing. Okay, we were grexing. That's what everybody seemed to think.
Is that a variant of grokking?
Well, grexing is what happens with slime mold. Slime mold usually are little tiny particles that exist as organisms on their own. But when the environment is threatened, or when there is some kind of change that feels limiting, the slime mold actually starts to form together to produce a fruiting body that then launches slime mold out into the atmosphere in order to find a more a place that they can survive. Yeah.
So this is a biological term.
It's a biological term that happens with slime mold. Grexing. And the interesting thing about grexing is some members of the grexing, it's a completely altruistic gathering, because some of the slime mold will not go. Some of the slime stays back on the deficient planet or the deficient area and launches the rest out. So there's a lot, I think, that of similarity in what we hope to do. It was a gathering of elders and advanced practitioners of a lot of traditional religious organizations. There was a Zen master from Korea who was Joan Halifax's teacher, Sansanim from Korea. There was a Tibetan Rinpoche there. There was elders from North American Indians, Native Americans, from shamans from Africa and from Australia. And there were also Western scientists like John Lilly and Fritjof Capra, who had written the Tao of Physics, Terence McKenna, who was an expert on psychotropic plants, Claudio Naranjo, a lot of psychologists, psychiatrists, physicists. It was really a grexing, in a sense, of all these different people and kinds of approaches that really did your periodic chart justice.
Sure.
There was as many of those kind of people coming in together to form this.
And Ralph Abrams was there.
Ralph Abrams came, right.
Jewish tradition.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the 1984.
1984, actually 30 years ago in May.
Right.
So
that's the same year I launched Philosophers of Peace, I think, in London.
Ah.
So I was kind of doing the same sort of thing, but in London. Okay, well, that's my first question. Thank you very much.
When you started that organization, what was that all about? I know that you had been studying philosophy, and that you, from our talks before, that you had felt like no one was getting together on this. They were kind of like, everybody was kind of doing their own thing in the academic world, and I know that you had some things about the academic world that didn't seem to come together, that needed something like you were doing. So where did that idea come from, and how did that get started?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, I started that group in 1984 in London, having spent 4 years in Canada as a private scholar, reading history of global philosophy, reading through the world's sacred texts. I was doing as a single scholar what you were doing as a conference, in effect. So rather, my goal was to empath into each tradition and lineage, and try and see where they're coming from. Having taken that kind of meta-Mahayana vow, Tibetan Buddhism was the first thing that really woke me up in '77. Then I found conventional philosophy in the Western world very arid. I worked at the University of Bristol. I studied at the University of Bristol conventional academic philosophy, and the prevailing intellectual climate was logical positivism, inspired by A.J. Ayer, which dismisses all discussion of anything that is non-empirical as literally false. You cannot talk about any metaphysical or spiritual experience because it is literally meaningless, according to A.J. Ayer's work, Language, Truth and Logic, which was inspired by the Vienna School of Logical Positivism. So I was wanting to articulate some of the experiences I'd had, in the 70s, and that whole wave of consciousness. I'd met people from California who had taught me a great deal already at the age of 18, 19, sitting up all night and learning about their experiences taking acid in California, and getting a feel for that incredible expansion of consciousness. And then going into academia and meeting people who are saying that's all literally nonsensical. To talk about that is meaningless. Let's get on with serious philosophy now. Which was about sort of analysing concepts down to their logical minimum and then putting it into mathematical notation, right? And then deciding which statements are true and false. I found that also trivial. That's not why I wanted to study philosophy. I'd fallen in love with philosophy because I'd read Spinoza, who said the intellectual love of God is the highest pleasure that man is capable of. And I'd fallen in love with that notion that it is possible to to reason out the nature of reality and then to love it, you know, and then to be told that that was meaningless activity, kind of really upset me at a very deep level.
And you can imagine that seems a little closer to what you wanted to do than these Western scientists, even, because Western scientists was taking all this gibberish about enlightenment and consciousness and saying, well, we have no basis in that, in the mechanical structure of the brain or human beings or anything like that. It would seem to me like spirituality would be closer in nature to philosophy than it would be to science. And yet we had all these these scientists who had mostly done experimentation with themselves and come to these results empirically, but in a way that's hard to measure, because it's not something you can really test. You can't test enlightenment. It's really difficult to find standardized testing that can be applied across, you know, a portion of the population.
Sure. No, I agree. I mean, I think what was happening in the 70s was that there were pockets of intellectuals all over the planet in different contexts. I mean, later I went to Russia and Moscow in 1990 and met some incredible philosophers there. And they were thinking cosmic thoughts. You know, they'd reached the same kind of position as some of the California thinkers through a different lineage. In Russia, there's a tradition of cosmism, and they had a chap called Vernadsky, who was equivalent to Teilhard de Chardin. He coined the phrase the noosphere and the biosphere.
Oh, okay.
So Vernadsky was a great Russian cosmic thinker who was talking about the whole of life that envelops Gaia, like James Lovelock later said. And, you know, is consciousness a kind of an emergent property within the life field? And its duty is to, you know, to sort of, it has a spiritual, you know, duty, as it were.
And isn't that interesting that as we're pondering these things, they're actually coming into being?
Yeah.
This, as a group consciousness, we're all coming into that consciousness anyway.
Yeah.
My path is different from so many people that I talk to, and yet we are coming to that. There is a kind of convergent point of view about human consciousness and an expansion.
What I loved, I mean, I also was a member for a while of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. Willis Harman and Edgar Mitchell and people, the Apollo astronaut.
Well, can you tell me more about that?
Well, they set up this institute in California to study what they call the noetic sciences. So if we have the noosphere, which is Aristotle's phrase for intellect is the nous, or the nous, which is the immortal part of the human being, according to Aristotle's philosophy. And so this concept of the noetic sciences studies that intellectual or spiritual side of human nature. I mean, I personally, as a philosopher, came to the position, like Ken Wilber, that spirituality, which is anti-intellectual, is not what's needed at the moment on the planet. You know, I respect Western science, mathematics and physics, and the hard intellectual edge of the Enlightenment. But I do think that it has to then go further, extend beyond itself, and study the noetic sciences, the spiritual transpersonal fields of experience. And that institute in California is one of the few places on the planet that does that.
Right, because I think generally the scientific atmosphere with questions like this is that it's hard to find a baseline to come from. It's hard to find a control group because these are such subjective experiences. And even people's experience of enlightenment is often so different and arrived at such different ways. It's kind of hard. It's one thing if we are studying people who have lost fingers, you know, or were born without fingers, how they function. But because you can make a judgment about that, you can make a scale of. But in terms of enlightenment or experiences that speak to you spiritually, it's kind of hard to pin down. There's not really a language for it. We all agree when we've had these experiences that they're common, but people who hadn't had these experiences before, they have no baseline from which to.
It's often hard to bridge that discourse, yeah. Right. I mean, I came across in the 80s when I was in London founding this Philosophers of Peace group around the time you were doing your conference in California. I did a course of study in transpersonal psychology, which was just developing as a field of knowledge. And in fact, transpersonal psychology is the branch of psychology that takes these peak experiences seriously, with Abraham Maslow, and it goes back to Carl Jung, who was a psychologist, depth psychologist, said that we have to take account of people's spiritual lives and study them scientifically. So I think ever since Jung and the Jungians realised that, in other words, not all spiritual experience is pathological. You know, it's a sign of healthiness. And Abraham Maslow said we should be studying the psychology of well-being and maximum health. So what is a peak experience? You know, we all feel good when we have happiness moments. So why don't we study those moments of happiness? If we're trying to create a wellness and a well-being on this planet, surely psychology should be studying that. So that's where I kind of started as a young academic. And then that's what I later did as a PhD. I looked at the notion of transpersonal history. But that leads me to another of my questions anyway. I'm not sure if I answered yours fully.
Well, that's a good start.
Yeah, which is, I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that you knew John Lilly, because he was one of the heroes I heard of, you know, in the 70s and read his Centre of the Cyclone and all that. Tell me about John Lilly and your friendship with him.
Well, my relationship to John Lilly is pure synchronicity.
Right, like all the best things.
Yeah, I hardly knew who he was or what he'd done or anything about him when I met him. But all these various things started coming into my life in certain ways. Like I was actually drawn to California through a conversation I'd had with Timothy Leary in their late 70s. And, and he sort of became